Hello and welcome. In our last video, we looked at a paper by Tommy Shelby, a philosopher who worked to apply Rawls's theory of justice to the topic of racism and racial inequality in America. This time around, we're going to stay on the same topic but get a different perspective. And we're going to be looking at some work by this philosopher right here, the late Charles Mills, who critiques Shelby's approach to using Rawls to addressing racial justice. So, here's where we want to go for today. We'll do a quick recap of Shelby's employment of Rawls as a remedy to racial injustices. And then we'll look at 5 objections that Mills will raise against Shelby. So first, it's that the principle that Shelby is using, the principle of equal opportunity, is one that Rawls doesn't bring in his own discussions of race. Second, racial justice is outside the realm of ideal theory. So Mills is interested in this notion of non-ideal theory, theories of justice for an imperfect world. And in this way, Mills says that we've got the wrong tools for the job. Moreover, Rawls has a deontological constraint on fair equality of opportunity. In other words, there are certain things that you just can't do in pursuing equal opportunity. In Rawls's political liberalism, we can see that there are appeals to an overlapping consensus, that we want to come together on non-controversial claims rather than the controversial ones. And Mills is going to say that this approach of non-controversy is going to make dealing with racism too hard. Finally, Mills will point out that we should think about racial justice and the problems that emerge in the context of racial justice and injustice. We want to see them as distinct from class injustice, and in this way, an appeal to fair equality of opportunity, Mills thinks is going to be inappropriate. So that's the plan. We're going to see a recap of where Shelby went, and then we're going to see Mills's critiques. So, his broader project, Charles Mills, is to show by elimination all the possible ways in which a Rawlsian or generally a liberal approach to justice, he's going to say that it's inadequate to deal with the problem of what Mills calls racial justice. And what he's thinking about is that there is a specific project that philosophers need to think about and understand, and it's the project of rectifying injustices that have already occurred, especially as they relate to racism and white supremacy. So we would have to look at the fact that, in these United States of America, for almost the first century of the country's existence and prior, when it was a group of colonies, African people were enslaved in this country. And even after African American people were citizens, there was still enslavement, and after emancipation, there were still highly oppressive Jim Crow laws in place. So the idea of racial justice is the matter of doing something to right these past wrongs. And here's a thing that Mills will note right off the start. It is a bit strange trying to look to Rawls on this because if you look at what Rawls said about race and racism, he did not have a substantively worked out approach. He said things here and there about race and racism and was clearly concerned about it as a real world problem, but he left the issue under-theorized. And we'll also find that, thousands of articles have been written about Rawls, hundreds of books have been written about Rawls, but very little of that discussion says much about racial inequality. It doesn't say much about certain programs like affirmative action. And in this way, we'll see that Rawls hasn't given us much information on how to deal with racial inequality. And the philosophers that do work on race and racism in political philosophy, philosophers like Bernard Boxall and Howard McGarry, they have little space in their books dedicated to Rawls, and it seems that they just don't find much useful in that writing as a way of addressing problems that they're interested in addressing, right? So it might seem that Shelby's approach is an admirable thing, that we take one of the most notable philosophers of the 20th century and give an explanation of how he can help us through the problem of racism and racial inequality. So, we can almost put things in terms of a formula. We have this idea of basic liberties. This is the first principle that is generated from behind the veil of ignorance. It's basically Rawls's idea that nobody should be oppressed, right? And these arrows here represent what Rawls would call lexical priority. So we say that if there's ever a conflict between questions about basic liberty and distributive justice, we're going to put our basic liberties ahead of distributive justice. And within distributive justice, the first thing that we want to make sure is that we have fair equality of opportunity, that positions of wealth acquisition, but also power, are open to all. And then after that, we get the difference principle, this idea that if we're going to have inequality of wealth in this society, we should have those inequalities set up in a way such that if there's going to be inequality, the worst case scenario will be made as good as possible. So you maximize the minimum. That's what the difference principle tells us. Now, Shelby's big idea in that last paper we looked at is that we can use this fair equality of opportunity principle. Think about what all the opportunities are in society, and we would think about things like access to basic resources, like shelter and food, but we would also think about things like educational opportunities, access to a high-quality university for not too much money. And we would think that in order to deal with those kinds of issues, we would have to transfer a great deal of wealth from well-off white communities into poorly off black communities, right? And that is sort of the main approach. We need to get to fair equality of opportunity, and only by correcting these historic wrongs, these legacies of Jim Crow and segregation and redlining, will we ever get to truly fair equality of opportunity. So the basic idea we have from Shelby is we will have to deal with making a fair set of opportunities for society. The only way that we do that is by counteracting the wrongs done in the past. So here are the critiques that we get from Mills. Mills points out first, if this is such a straightforward argument, why did Rawls never apply the principle himself in this fashion, right? It's not just that he never said something, because, philosophers aren't going to say every possible thing that anybody might ever ask them about. But the point is, it would have been natural for him to bring up this idea that we should be correcting against the wrongs of segregation, Jim Crow, and redlining. Well, here's what Mills points out. He says that Rawls himself did not apply this fair equality of opportunity principle in those cases where it would have been natural for him to do so. And, for instance, he claimed that problems involving race, ethnicity, and gender seem of an altogether different character and calling for different principles of justice beyond these basic principles of basic liberties, fair equality of opportunity, and the difference principle. So in this way, Rawls, in an important way, is just saying, like, look, the problem that we're seeing here is not one that the principles that I've laid out will actually address. Part of why this is that Rawls's theory of justice as fairness, these rules we come up with from behind the veil of ignorance, is focused on what an ideal, well-ordered society would look like. And we might think that once we start to deal with racial and gender injustices, we're dealing with a society where people are acting in ways that are far apart from this ideal. And if we're dealing with something far away from that ideal, it doesn't really have anything in the ideal theory to tell us how to get from the problematic state to the perfect state. And in this way, we're saying, like, look, Rawlsian tools are not suited for these particular kinds of real-world problems. Now, Mills says of Shelby that the difference between ideal theory and non-ideal theory isn't the difference between general principles and their applications. Mills thinks that Shelby seems to be assuming that. But here's what Mills thinks that we are doing when we do non-ideal theory, right? A good example would be something like affirmative action, right? We note that there have been unequal distributions of wealth in our society, which lead to different access to schools, which leads to different actual outcomes in the opportunities that people receive. And so Mills is open to the idea that maybe race should be a consideration when we decide whether a person deserves to go to an Ivy League college or to get into a law school. But here's the rub. This sort of non-ideal approach, this remedy to an unjust situation, Mills says it might be incompatible with justice as fairness. Maybe we wouldn't ever accept an affirmative action program from behind the veil of ignorance. Furthermore, rectificatory injustice is about correcting unjust distributions, and if we're giving it an ideal theory, we're just saying what the correct ones are. So it doesn't tell us how we move those resources around, especially without violating people's rights, right? And in this way, we think, like, look, how do we get from a society affected by past wrongs to the well-ordered society? Mills will even say here that ideal theory that isn't well-suited to deal with perhaps pragmatic solutions to particular problems, thinking too much in terms of the ideals of basic liberties, fair equality of opportunity, and the difference principle, might actually hinder rather than help us in our thinking about how to solve these problems. Now, last thing that Mills says is that when we're talking about rectification, this is different than just distributing things fairly. In this way, he's actually following a point of Nozick's. The fact that some money is transferred from one person to another person just tells us about the strict distributions, but it doesn't tell us anything about whether it was justified. Because a person giving $20 to another person, that might be an instance of paying a loan, making a loan, paying a bribe, a theft, a gift. The details count. And we might think that just making society fairer and more accessible still doesn't quite count as rectification by Mills's standard. Rectification has to be done with the acknowledgement of the past wrongs and done for the sake of evening things out. It's not just about a particular distribution of wealth or goods. Moreover, when we look at fair equality of opportunity, we'll notice that Rawls gives us deontological constraints. Remember, we said that the basic liberties principle, the arrow is basically supposed to say this is above, or this trumps the fair equality of opportunity principle. Right? So, thinking in Rawls's terms for a second, we can realize that you couldn't violate people's basic liberties to get people more opportunities, or you couldn't violate people's right to property or to choose when and how they work in order to do a little better by the standard of the difference principle. Right? So once we take on Shelby's suggestion that we're supposed to redistribute wealth until society achieves this equality of opportunity, we might realize that some of these strategies for evening out opportunity levels would themselves be incompatible in their application with fair equality of opportunity, or they might violate a basic liberty. One of Rawls's favored basic liberties is private property rights. Right? That is one of the liberties that everybody should be given in a society where we are not oppressed. So we would be highly hampered in our goal of maximizing equal opportunity if we have to give priority to certain basic liberties. Fourth, Rawls points out in his defense of political liberalism, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, that when we think about society, we want it to be a cooperative society where it's not forced on people to live together and work together and cooperate. Right? But Rawls's big idea is that once we start building out a society, we want to build it on the basis of an overlapping consensus, rather than having anybody's particular moral, religious, and philosophical outlooks dominating one another. Right? So in this way, we have to focus on what is known non-controversially. Another way of putting this is we cannot bring our comprehensive doctrines into our public policy and rulemaking for society. Now, it is true that for Rawls, we have like a couple of different phases of the veil of ignorance, right? So at the first phase, we know very little about not only ourselves, but also the society that we wind in. But Shelby rightly pointed out that Rawls does have a mechanism where after we figure out the basic principles, we could have a constitutional phase where we know more general facts about human society and maybe how society is functioning in a particular moment. But here's the issue that Mills sees. Claims about the history of race will be hugely controversial. So, for instance, when we look at certain bits of social science, they will tell us things like the reason why black folks have less wealth in America nowadays is because of racist Jim Crow policies, but also policies that have carried into the 20th century, like redlining, which prevented black families after the Second World War from getting home mortgages. Now, Mills is going to point out that the common ideology in American culture and among white people is an approach of what he calls colorblindness, right? That we are all equals and that we shouldn't appeal to race in thinking about what a person deserves. And this colorblind ideology will also sometimes claim that ultimately wealth differences are going to be explained in terms of, how diligently a person has applied themselves to solving problems in the real world. But this sort of colorblindness creates a problem, right? Because it makes claims about the history of American racism into points of controversy. So as Mills puts it, were Shelby to accede to the Rawlsian stipulation to leave controversy at the door, he would immediately be depriving himself of the weapons he needs to win his case. That is, he needs certain pieces of social science in order to explain that black families, even nowadays, have, because of certain social structures, fewer opportunities. Now, Mills says, I'm not a Rawlsian, as Shelby is, so I don't have to, check controversy at the door. Mills basically says, I'm fine with having the intellectual courage to say, well, this might be a controversial claim about the sources of inequality in American society, but it's also a true claim. And in that way, Mills doesn't have to check controversy at the door in the same way that Shelby will as a follower of Rawls. And fifth, Mills is saying that maybe a problem with this fair equality of opportunity approach, just in general, is that when we take the Rawlsian approach of fair equality of opportunities, it doesn't appeal to racial discrimination explicitly, and in this way, it's appealing mainly to concerns about class and social mobility. But in this way, Mills says maybe we're missing an important distinction here. Here's how he puts it. He says that if you compare right liberalism with left liberalism, a simple contrast is that right-leaning liberals want negative rights. They want the right to be left alone, whereas left liberals want positive rights. So maybe like a positive right to a flourishing life and to be entitled to the means to secure it. Things like a high-quality education or healthcare. And in this way, we can think about like formal egalitarianism versus strong egalitarianism, which brings in more duties to provide for others on the left side. But in Shelby's approach, he's basically saying we should be thinking about Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity in terms of these more substantive left-leaning approaches to liberty. But Mills will point out we only need the weaker right egalitarianism to critique racial discrimination. So we would say that it is a violation of black people's negative liberties, their liberty to be left alone and to do as they please when we think about their exclusion from accessing housing, or when we think about the ways in which they were prevented from accessing the vote in the Jim Crow era prior to the Civil Rights Movement. So in this way, we might say that these appeals to class inequality, that's mainly the more controversial appeal from left liberals. But this appeal to fair equality of opportunity is maybe beside the point. We might better explain the wrongs of racial injustice by looking at the way in which non-interference is what people deserve, and that violation of our basic natural rights is a more helpful way of understanding the injustice that has been done to black folks in the United States. So to sum up, we have these 5 critiques, right? Whereas Shelby gave us this appeal to fair equality of opportunity, Mills sees that appeal as inadequate to theorizing about and eventually achieving racial justice, a proper addressing of the wrongs that have been done in American history. And more broadly, he's saying this isn't just an issue with Shelby's exposition of the issue. In fact, more broadly, he thinks that any strategy that is using ideal theory and these general principles of fair equality of opportunity, that is going to be too deeply entrenched in the philosophical approach of ideal theory. And this approach to ideal theory will ultimately not help us in our philosophizing about making a more racially just society. So that's where we're going to end. It seems like we have some interesting and formidable objections to Shelby from Mills, but I will point out I've tried to give some of the first words on this debate. It's interesting that Shelby did publish a response to Mills in the journal Critical Philosophy of Race. And in that article, Shelby will give his responses to these critiques given by Mills. So for those of you keenly interested, I encourage you to go find that paper. I've noticed that by Googling the title, it seems that even Shelby has that paper available for free on his website, and you can delve even deeper into the debate by going there next. So, thanks for listening in today, and as always, if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and to keep this discussion going. Thanks very much. Take care.